I feel that I've been really blessed as a person in my profession. It's a profession that it's a killer profession. It can be cruel. It can be almost inhuman, like a lot of other strong professions. It certainly has its dark side.
There are two versions of Robert Redford that most people carry in their minds. One is the golden-haired outlaw from the Sundance Kid, forever young, forever grinning against the odds. The other is the quiet old man who spent his final years in the mountains of Utah, far from cameras, far from noise. Between those two images lies a story rarely told in full, not one of fame, but of devotion. Because before the world knew him as a movie star, Robert Redford already understood something most people spend a lifetime chasing: that love, real love, is rarely loud. It was only in his final years, through the scattered fragments of interviews, tributes and reflections he gave publicly, that the shape of who he loved most began to come into focus. Not a rumor. Not a scandal. Something far more human. To understand that answer, you have to go back to the beginning, long before Hollywood ever noticed him. Robert Redford was born in 1936 in Santa Monica, California, into a modest household shaped by hard work and quiet discipline. His mother, Martha, was a steadying presence in his early life, someone he would later describe as instrumental in shaping his sense of curiosity and independence. Her death when Redford was still a young man left a mark that friends and biographers have long pointed to as a turning point, the moment a restless teenager began searching for meaning beyond the world he already knew. That searching would eventually lead him to art school, then briefly to Europe, and finally to acting, almost by accident. But it was not fame that anchored him. It was family. In 1958, Redford married Lola Van Wagenen, a decision made before he had any real career to speak of. Their marriage would last 27 years and produce 4 children, a length of time rarely acknowledged in the retellings of his glamorous public image. Those years were not without heartbreak. Their first child, a son named Scott, died in infancy, a loss that friends have said profoundly affected both parents and quietly shaped Redford's private worldview for the rest of his life. It is a detail often left out of the highlight reels, yet it may be one of the most defining moments of his early adulthood, proof that behind the golden persona was a man who understood loss long before the world ever saw him smile on screen. As his career expanded through the 60s and 70s, Redford became something rare in Hollywood, a star who protected his personal life fiercely, even as his professional one exploded into global stardom. Films like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, and All the President's Men made him one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. Yet interviews from that era reveal a man who spoke more comfortably about mountains, rivers, and land conservation than about fame itself. Colleagues frequently noted that Redford seemed almost uncomfortable with celebrity, treating it as a byproduct of his work rather than the purpose of it. This tension between public image and private values eventually led him toward one of the most consequential decisions of his life: the creation of the Sundance Institute in 1981. It was not simply a business venture. It was, by his own repeated description in public forums over the decades, an act of love for independent storytelling and for artists who lacked the platform he had been given. Utah itself became something close to a second family to him, a place he returned to again and again, both physically and emotionally throughout his life. Biographers and journalists who covered him extensively often noted that Redford spoke about the mountains of Provo Canyon with the same tenderness most people reserve for people, not places. Yet even as Sundance grew into a cultural institution, Redford's personal life was quietly shifting. His marriage to Lola ended in 1985, a separation that was handled with unusual privacy for a couple so famous. Neither party engaged in public disputes or tabloid battles, a restraint that stood out sharply against the backdrop of Hollywood divorces of that era. Those close to the family later suggested that the split, while painful, was rooted in growth and change rather than betrayal, two people whose lives had simply diverged over nearly 3 decades together. It would be years before Redford's name became linked romantically to anyone else in a serious, lasting way. When it finally happened, it happened quietly, almost invisibly to the public eye. He met Sibylle Szaggars, a German-born artist, sometime in the early 1990s. Unlike his first marriage, which began in the shadow of ambition and uncertainty, this relationship developed slowly, largely outside the spotlight. Szaggars was not a celebrity in the traditional sense. She was a painter, someone deeply connected to nature and environmental art, interests that aligned closely with Redford's own lifelong advocacy for conservation. For nearly 2 decades, the couple maintained a partnership that Redford rarely discussed in detail, even as his fame continued to grow through films like Out of Africa, Quiz Show, and Spy Game. It wasn't until 2009 that they married in a small private ceremony in Hamburg, Germany, a decision that surprised many who had assumed Redford would remain permanently private about his romantic life. In the rare interviews where he addressed the marriage afterward, Redford spoke not of passion in the dramatic sense often portrayed in films, but of partnership, of finding someone who understood his need for solitude, his connection to the land, and his complicated relationship with public attention. As Redford aged, his public statements increasingly reflected a shift in priorities. Awards and accolades, once markers of a rising career, became secondary to reflections on family, legacy, and the passage of time. He often spoke about his children not as extensions of his fame, but as the people who taught him the most enduring lessons of his life. Tragedy struck again in 2020, when his son James, known as Jamie, passed away after a long battle with cancer. Jamie had spent much of his adult life as a filmmaker and environmental advocate, following in some of his father's footsteps while carving out his own identity. Those who knew the family well described the loss as one of the most devastating moments of Redford's later years, a grief he carried privately, much like the loss of his firstborn decades earlier. It is within this context, decades of quiet loss, steady partnership, and evolving priorities, that the question posed by his later life reflections becomes clearer. When journalists occasionally asked him in his final years about love, legacy, and what mattered most, Redford's answers consistently circled back not to any single romantic relationship, but to the idea of enduring connection itself. He spoke about Sibylle as a steadying presence, someone who shared his values rather than his fame. He spoke about his children, both those he lost and those who remained, as the truest measure of a life well lived. And he spoke again and again about the land itself, the mountains, the rivers, the quiet spaces where he felt most like himself, far from any screen. Robert Redford passed away in September 2025, at the age of 89, at his home in Utah, the very landscape he had spent a lifetime protecting and returning to. His death marked the end of an era in American cinema, but it also closed the final chapter on a life that, despite its fame, remained remarkably consistent in its values. He did not build a legacy on scandal or spectacle. He built it on land conservation, independent storytelling, and relationships that, while not always perfect, were rooted in loyalty and quiet devotion. So when the question is asked, who did Robert Redford love most? The honest answer resists simplicity. It was not one person, one place, or one moment. It was the accumulation of a life spent choosing depth over noise. It was Lola, who shared his early years and the grief of losing a child. It was Sibylle, who understood his need for privacy and shared his passion for art and nature. It was his children, whose lives shaped his own in ways fame never could. And it was the land itself, the mountains he returned to again and again, as if searching for something steadier than applause. In the end, Redford's story offers a quiet lesson increasingly rare in modern celebrity culture. Real love, the kind that lasts, is rarely dramatic. It is built in decades, not headlines. It survives loss, adapts through change, and often reveals itself not through grand declarations, but through the choices a person makes when no one is watching. Robert Redford spent nearly 6 decades in the public eye, yet the things he valued most were the things he protected from that very spotlight. Perhaps that, more than any award or performance, is his most lasting legacy, proof that a life well lived is measured not by how loudly it is celebrated, but by how deeply it is felt by those who were truly loved.